Dr. Marcus Hale had always been fascinated by the unknown. An exobiologist by profession, he spent his days studying alien species and phenomena, always searching for signs of life beyond Earth. On that particular night, the sky above him was alight with meteors. They streaked across the heavens, burning like fiery trails of stars. Marcus had taken his telescope to the hills outside the city, hoping to catch a glimpse of the celestial display. But as he peered through the lens, something caught his eye that wasn't a meteor. Far below, near the edge of the forest, something bright had fallen, something with a glow unlike anything he had ever seen. Curious and driven by the feeling that he had stumbled upon something extraordinary, Marcus grabbed his flashlight and hurried down the path toward the site of the crash. The air was cool, the trees thick and quiet around him. His heart beat faster as he neared the glow. When he reached the clearing, he was stunned by what he saw. A small silver-colored pod, no larger than a minivan, sat at an odd angle, embedded slightly into the soft earth. The pod glowed faintly, a soft pulse of light coming from its surface. It looked like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. Marcus's mind raced. This couldn't be a meteor. It was too structured, too perfect. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he carefully approached the object. He crouched down next to the pod and examined it closely. It was sleek, almost organic in shape, with strange symbols etched into its surface. It looked like someone, had designed it with purpose, not just a random crash. A sudden noise made him jump. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the trees. There was nothing there. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Something small, something alive. He turned back to the pod. It was opening. The side of it shifted, revealing a small compartment, and within it lay a figure. At first, Marcus thought it was just a bundle of strange clothes or equipment, but as the figure began to move, he saw that it was alive. A girl, or at least she appeared to be. She was humanoid, but not quite human. Her skin was a pale, shimmering silver, and her eyes were large, dark, and filled with a kind of deep, haunted knowledge. Her hair, if it could be called that, was like long tendrils of light, almost like bioluminescent fibers. She sat up slowly, her gaze fixing on Marcus with both curiosity and fear. She opened her mouth, but the sound that came out was unlike anything he had ever heard. A soft, melodic noise that almost sounded like a song. Marcus didn't understand the language, but her eyes told him she was desperate, confused, and possibly in pain. He took a step forward, his instincts as a scientist urging him to help her. His first thought was to get her medical attention, but he knew she wasn't from Earth. He couldn't just call for an ambulance. "Hey, it's okay," Marcus said gently, kneeling down to her level. "I won't hurt you. Are you all right?" The girl tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made him shiver. She raised a thin arm and pointed at something in the distance, her fingers trembling. Marcus followed her gesture, but saw nothing of importance, just the dark woods surrounding them. When he looked back, the girl was starting to stand, wobbling slightly on her feet. He realized then that she was in no condition to walk. Her clothes were torn, and she appeared weak, almost as if the journey to Earth had drained her of her strength. Marcus couldn't just leave her here. She needed help, even if he didn't understand where she had come from or who she was. He gently helped her to her feet, speaking softly to reassure her, though he wasn't sure she understood his words. "I'll take you somewhere safe," he promised. "You'll be okay." The girl gave a weak nod, and Marcus carefully guided her toward his car. As they walked, he noticed the subtle glow that seemed to emanate from her skin, almost like a faint aura. The sight intrigued him. What kind of creature was she? What kind of being had he just encountered? When they reached the car, Marcus helped the girl into the passenger seat, being careful not to cause her any more discomfort. He drove back to his small lab on the outskirts of town, his mind racing with questions, There was no doubt in his mind that this girl was not human. But what was she? And why had she come to Earth? More importantly, was she alone? As Marcus drove, the girl looked out the window, her expression distant, almost lost in thought. But then she turned toward him, her large eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. Without speaking, she reached up and touched the side of her neck, pointing to the strange markings there. Marcus stared at her hand, his mind working furiously. Whatever those markings meant, they were important. And somehow, he knew that this encounter was only the beginning of something far bigger than anything he had ever imagined. Marcus Hale's small lab on the edge of town was a far cry from the sterile facilities where he had once worked for the government. It was cramped, filled with books, equipment, and scattered research papers. But it was his, and it was the only place where he could be truly free to explore his passions without the constraints of bureaucracy. He parked the car in the small driveway and quickly opened the door to the passenger seat, helping the alien girl out of the car. Her fragile form wobbled slightly as she tried to stand on her own. The glow from her skin was faint now, but still visible in the dim light of the lab's entryway. Marcus gently guided her inside. She was more fragile than he had initially realized, and he feared that if she didn't get proper rest and nutrition soon, her condition could worsen. He had no idea what kind of alien physiology she had, but he couldn't let her suffer. "Come on, let's get you settled," Marcus said quietly, leading her to a small cot in the corner of the lab. The girl didn't resist. She followed him obediently, her eyes flicking around the room with curiosity. The lab was full of strange equipment, books, and odd tools, but she didn't seem frightened. In fact, she seemed fascinated. Her large eyes moved from one item to the next, studying everything with a deep sense of wonder, as if everything she saw was new and incredible. Once she sat down on the cot, Marcus grabbed a blanket from a nearby shelf and draped it over her. The room was cold, but the girl didn't seem to mind. Her body temperature was much lower than a human's, which made Marcus wonder again what kind of species she was. He had never seen anything like her. And the more he observed her, the more questions piled up. As he busied himself preparing a small space heater to keep her warm, the girl suddenly spoke. It was a soft, melodic sound, but the words were completely unfamiliar to him. He couldn't understand a single one. Marcus paused, looking at her. "What did you say?" The girl looked at him, her expression a mix of frustration and sadness. She touched her throat and then pointed to her chest, as if trying to show that she didn't understand him either. She spoke again, but it was a series of sounds that Marcus couldn't make sense of. "Don't worry," Marcus said gently, trying to reassure her. "We'll figure this out, I promise." He moved to the other side of the lab, where he had a small portable computer. He quickly pulled up a translation program, hoping to find something that could help bridge the communication gap. But as he typed in a few words, he realized that nothing in the database matched the language she had spoken. It wasn't any human language, nor did it seem to match any known alien dialects he had studied. Frustrated but determined, Marcus returned to the cot, kneeling in front of her. "We're going to take this slow, okay?" He smiled kindly. "We'll figure out how to talk to each other." The girl looked at him with her large, dark eyes, studying his face. After a long moment, she nodded faintly. She then reached up, touching her chest again, and made a sound that was different from the others, almost like she was trying to introduce herself. Marcus's heart raced. She was trying to communicate, and that was a good sign. Maybe they could find a way to understand each other after all. But for now, he would have to rely on other means. He sat down on a chair across from her, his mind racing. He had no idea what kind of alien race she came from or what she was doing on Earth. But one thing was clear. She was not a threat. Her body language showed no signs of aggression, and she seemed as scared and confused as he was. Marcus's thoughts turned back to the pod, the strange markings on it, and the way she had pointed to her neck earlier. What did it all mean? Why had she crashed on Earth? And why had she ended up in his lap? He needed answers. For the next few hours, Marcus and the girl went through a series of attempts at communication. He tried simple gestures, pointing to objects and repeating their names in English. She watched carefully, occasionally mimicking him, though she didn't speak. But Marcus could see that she was intelligent. Her eyes followed every movement he made, and she seemed to be processing everything quickly. When he showed her a photo of his daughter, who had passed away several years ago, her expression softened, and she placed a hand over her heart. It was as if she understood the emotion behind the picture. That gave Marcus a sense of hope. By the time night fell, the girl had fallen into a peaceful sleep on the cot, her body still trembling slightly from the cold. Marcus watched her for a moment, his thoughts heavy with uncertainty. What had he gotten himself into? What was going to happen to her? He had no answers, but one thing was certain: he couldn't just let her go. She was scared, alone, and in need of help. And Marcus Hale had made a promise to himself that he would do whatever it took to protect her. As he sat at his desk, typing up notes about the day's events, Marcus's mind wandered back to the moment when he had found her, lost in the woods and looking like something out of a dream. She wasn't just a stranger to him. She had become something much more, a part of his family. And whatever mysteries lay ahead, he would face them alongside her, together. The days that followed were a blur of learning and discovery. Marcus spent every waking moment trying to understand the girl he had brought into his home. She was intelligent, far more so than he had expected, but her way of communicating was challenging. At first, they relied on simple gestures and drawing pictures to bridge the language gap. He showed her the basic things around the house: a table, a chair, a book. She pointed, and he said the word aloud, hoping she would learn it. She caught on quickly, repeating the words back to him with a soft, melodic voice that was always full of wonder. She never seemed frustrated with the process, always trying her best to understand him. The more she learned, the more Marcus realized just how advanced she was. The way she studied everything, her attention to detail, was something he had only seen in highly trained minds. But even as the communication barrier began to shrink, there were moments when Marcus still felt like he was missing something important, like there was a piece of the puzzle he wasn't seeing. One afternoon, after a few days of silence between them, the girl, who he had begun to call Lyra, surprised him. She sat at the small desk in the corner of the lab, scribbling on a piece of paper. At first, Marcus thought she was drawing, like children do when they want to express themselves. But when he looked closer, his heart skipped a beat. The symbols she had drawn were the same as the ones on the pod, the markings he had seen when he found her. They weren't just random scribbles. They were intentional, crafted with care. Lyra's eyes met his, and she hesitated for a moment before pointing to the symbols on the paper. "Is this your language?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with a mix of curiosity and hope. Lyra nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at the drawings. She reached out and touched one of the symbols, her fingers tracing its shape as if she were grounding herself in something familiar. Marcus knew then that this wasn't just some alien child who had crash-landed on Earth. Lyra wasn't just lost. She was from somewhere, a place where these symbols held meaning. But what did they mean? Why had she come here? He could see the sadness in her eyes when she looked away from the symbols. For a moment, the lively spark that usually danced in her gaze faded, replaced by a deep sorrow. Lyra's hand drifted to her chest, and Marcus realized that this small gesture was her way of telling him that the symbols were connected to something personal, something important, maybe even painful. Without knowing what else to say, Marcus sat beside her, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's okay," he said quietly. "We'll figure this out, together." Lyra turned to him, her eyes glistening, and for the first time, she smiled. Just a small, uncertain smile, but it was enough to make Marcus's heart swell. She trusted him in her own way. And that trust meant more to him than anything else. The days became a routine. Marcus continued his work, and Lyra continued to explore his lab, her fascination with Earth's technology growing each day. She would sit for hours, watching him work with his computers, and sometimes she would mimic his movements. She seemed especially intrigued by the way Marcus would analyze DNA samples, carefully separating cells and studying their structures. To her, it must have looked like magic. One evening, as Marcus was sorting through his research notes, he heard a soft thud behind him. Turning around, he saw Lyra standing by the window, looking out at the dark sky. She had her hand pressed to the glass, her eyes scanning the horizon with a mixture of longing and fear. "Lyra," Marcus called, walking over to her. She didn't answer at first, her gaze still fixed on the distant stars. Then, slowly, she turned toward him, her face shadowed in the dim light. Without speaking, she pointed to the sky, then to herself, and then back at the sky. The gesture was simple, but Marcus understood what she meant. She was homesick. She missed her world. For the first time, Marcus felt the full weight of her situation. He had been so focused on helping her adapt to life on Earth that he had forgotten how deeply she must have longed for her own people, her own planet. Lyra was alone in a strange world, with no way to return home. A wave of protectiveness swept over him. She was his responsibility now. And no matter what it took, he wouldn't let her stay lost forever. "I know you want to go home," Marcus said softly, crouching down next to her. "I promise, I'll do everything I can to help you." Lyra's eyes flickered with hope, but there was still a trace of sadness in her gaze. Marcus could tell that, deep down, she wasn't sure if she could ever return to her home. Her journey had been hard, and Earth was so different from what she had known. But the connection between them was real. In some strange way, they had become a family. Over the next few days, Marcus worked even harder to understand the symbols Lyra had shown him. He tried to match them with any known language patterns, hoping to find a clue. But nothing seemed to fit. It was like the puzzle pieces were all scattered across a vast, uncharted galaxy. One evening, as he sat staring at his computer, trying to piece it all together, Lyra approached him once more. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and when he turned to face her, she held up a small device. It was unlike anything he had seen before, sleek and small, with buttons that seemed to glow faintly. "Lyra, where did you?" Marcus began, but she cut him off, pointing at the device, and then at her chest. It was a communicator, a way for her to reach out, to speak to others, to contact her people. Her journey wasn't over, and together, they would find a way to bring her home. The days seemed to blur together as Marcus worked tirelessly on figuring out the strange device Lyra had shown him. It was small, no bigger than the palm of his hand, and its surface was sleek and metallic. There were no markings on it, no buttons that could explain how it worked. The only clue was the faint glow that pulsed in sync with Lyra's breath. She had placed it in his hands, her eyes full of hope and trust. Marcus studied it carefully, his mind racing. He had seen many pieces of alien technology in his career, but none that seemed so advanced and yet so simple at the same time. He had no idea what it could do, but he knew it was important. Lyra had carried it with her for a reason, and she seemed to believe that it could help her communicate with her people. He ran his fingers over the surface, searching for any hidden buttons or controls. After several minutes, he noticed something odd. There was a small indentation near the center of the device. Marcus pressed it gently, and to his surprise, a soft click echoed from the device. The glow of the surface shifted, and suddenly, a holographic image appeared before him. The image was blurry at first, flickering like a dying light. But then it began to sharpen, and Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He saw a woman, tall, regal, with the same shimmering skin and dark eyes as Lyra. She was surrounded by several others who appeared to be of the same species, all wearing similar clothing. They were standing in what looked like a grand hall, a place filled with advanced technology and symbols that Marcus didn't recognize. The woman in the image raised her hand, and her voice, though muffled, filled the room. It was soft and calm, but it carried a weight of authority. Lyra's eyes widened when she saw the woman in the hologram. Her face lit up with recognition, and she leaned closer to the image, as if trying to reach out to her. The voice continued, though Marcus could only make out a few words. It sounded like a language similar to the one Lyra had spoken when they first met, but it was more fluid, more confident. Then the image shifted. The woman in the hologram seemed to be speaking directly to Lyra, her eyes focused on her. For a brief moment, Marcus thought he could see a hint of sorrow in the woman's expression. She reached out with her hand, and in the next instant, the hologram cut off abruptly, leaving only a faint glow in the air. Lyra stood there in stunned silence, her hand hovering above the empty space where the image had been. Her chest rose and fell quickly, as if the encounter had left her breathless. Marcus felt a wave of concern wash over him. "What was that?" he asked gently, his voice filled with curiosity and empathy. Lyra turned to him, her eyes wide, and then she touched her chest. It was clear she was trying to explain something, but the words escaped her. She reached down and picked up a piece of paper, drawing quickly. The lines were shaky but clear, a drawing of the woman from the hologram, surrounded by other figures. At the bottom, Lyra drew a symbol, one that looked similar to the markings on the pod she had arrived in. When she was finished, she held the paper up for Marcus to see. The woman in the drawing was not just someone important to Lyra. She was her mother. Marcus's heart ached. He knew Lyra had been homesick, but now it was clear that her situation was far more complicated than he had imagined. She wasn't just a lost traveler. She was part of something far bigger. She had a family, a people, and a place she was meant to be. But something had gone terribly wrong. He swallowed, trying to find the right words. I think that was your mother," he said softly. "She's trying to reach you, to help you." Lyra nodded, her expression filled with a mixture of sadness and longing. She looked at the empty space where the hologram had been, as if hoping it might return, as if hoping her mother might be able to give her the answers she so desperately needed. But the silence that followed was deafening. The device lay in Marcus's hands, its glow dimming as if it, too, had exhausted its power. Lyra's face fell, and Marcus could feel her pain. "I'm so sorry, Lyra," he said quietly, his voice filled with sorrow. "I wish I could do more." Lyra didn't speak, but she gave him a soft, almost imperceptible nod. She understood. She had been through so much, and even though she was far from home, she had learned to trust Marcus. Her heart was full of unanswered questions, and every day seemed to bring more mystery than clarity. But she was not alone anymore. And for now, that was something she could hold on to. Marcus sat beside her, holding the device carefully. He had no idea how to fix it or how to help Lyra reach her people, but he wasn't going to give up. He couldn't. There was no turning back now. He had promised to help her, and he would keep that promise. As night fell and the lad grew quiet, Marcus looked out the window at the starry sky. Somewhere out there, Lyra's home was waiting for her. It was a long, uncertain road ahead, but with each passing day, they were one step closer to finding the answers. And with that, they would discover the true meaning of family. The days after the hologram's message were filled with questions that seemed to grow larger with each passing hour. Marcus couldn't shake the image of Lyra's mother from his mind. The sorrow in her eyes had been unmistakable. The hologram had been clear. This woman, who looked so much like Lyra, was searching for her. She had been trying to reach her, to help her. But why had the message stopped so suddenly? Every night, Marcus would stay up late, combing through old research papers and alien texts, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the device and how to make it work. He had a feeling that it wasn't just a simple communication tool. It had to be something more. He couldn't let it sit in a corner while Lyra's family waited for her to return home. The next day, as Marcus worked in his lab, Lyra approached him. She seemed quieter than usual, her expression far more serious. She stood near the desk, holding something in her hands. It was a small, crystalline object, one he had never seen before. It shimmered in the light, and Marcus could tell it was just as important as the communicator. "What's this?" Marcus asked gently, setting down his papers to focus on her. Lyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. She placed the crystal on the table and pointed to it, then gestured to the hologram device in his hands. "You think it's connected to the device?" Marcus asked, eyeing the crystal with growing curiosity. She nodded, her face serious. Without saying a word, Lyra took the crystal and held it in her hand for a moment. Then she gently pressed it into the side of the communicator. A soft hum filled the air, and Marcus's heart raced. He had no idea what was going to happen next, but he couldn't look away. The device flickered to life once again, this time with much more energy. The hologram appeared, but it wasn't the same as before. The image was clearer, and this time Marcus could make out more details. The woman, Lyra's mother, was there, along with several others, all standing in a room filled with strange machinery. The room seemed familiar in some way, but Marcus couldn't place it. The woman in the hologram spoke again, her voice carrying the same tone of authority and warmth. But this time, her words were more urgent, and as she spoke, her eyes locked onto the device, as if she knew it was reaching her daughter. "Lyra," the woman said in a language Marcus couldn't understand, "I have found a way to reach you. Please, listen carefully." Lyra's eyes widened, her hands shaking as she held onto the device. She was hearing her mother's voice again, and Marcus could feel the weight of the moment. This was more than just a message. It was a lifeline. The hologram continued, but this time, the woman's words were filled with caution. "You must hurry. The situation is dire. We are running out of time. Our enemies have found us, and they are coming for you. I have left a trail, a way for you to return, but you must act quickly." Lyra's heart raced as she listened to her mother's message. Marcus watched her carefully, understanding the urgency in her expression. The fear in the woman's voice had been unmistakable. Someone was after them. But who? The woman in the hologram's face softened as she spoke again. "Lyra, you are the key. Your knowledge, your strength, and your destiny are the only things that can save us. Please, do not wait any longer. You are not alone. We are with you, always." As the hologram flickered and faded, Lyra stood still, her hands trembling. She didn't speak, but Marcus could see the conflict in her eyes. She was torn between the need to return to her home and the fear of what awaited her there. Marcus stepped closer, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "We'll figure this out, Lyra. We'll help you." For a long time, Lyra said nothing, but her gaze softened. She reached up and touched his hand, her touch light, but filled with gratitude. She was still processing everything, but Marcus could see that she was beginning to accept the truth of her situation. She wasn't just a lost alien on Earth. She was a key player in a larger conflict, and whatever was happening, she had to face it. After a moment, Lyra spoke softly, her voice barely a whisper. "We must go." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. "Go? Where?" Lyra pointed to the window, her eyes filled with resolve. "To the place where it all began. The trail my mother left. It's here, somewhere on Earth. We must find it." Marcus stood frozen for a moment. The weight of her words sank in. They weren't just looking for answers anymore. They were looking for a way to stop whatever was coming. And they were going to need help. "I'll need time to prepare," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the rising tension inside him. "We'll gather what we need. You're not alone in this, Lyra. I promise." Lyra nodded, a flicker of hope returning to her eyes. She trusted him, and that trust meant everything. She had come so far already, and now she was ready to take the next step. The two of them worked together to plan their journey. Marcus gathered supplies, checking and rechecking his equipment. Lyra stood quietly by his side, looking out the window at the distant stars, as if already preparing herself for the challenges ahead. When everything was ready, Marcus turned to Lyra, his face serious but kind. "Are you ready?" Lyra took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." They left the lab behind, stepping into the unknown. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. And somewhere out there, Lyra's mother was waiting. The journey to find her, and to stop the danger that loomed, had only just begun. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Marcus and Lyra knew they couldn't wait any longer. The message from Lyra's mother had been clear. They were running out of time. The danger was already close, and it was up to them to find the trail and uncover the truth. Marcus packed his gear carefully, checking every tool and piece of equipment. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Lyra stood beside him, her eyes focused and serious. She had grown quieter in the past few days, but her determination was unmistakable. She wasn't the lost alien girl who had first arrived on Earth. She was something much more. Someone with a purpose, someone who was ready to face whatever challenge lay ahead. After gathering everything they would need, Marcus led Lyra to the old van parked outside. It wasn't much, an old, rusted vehicle that had seen better days, but it would get them where they needed to go. Lyra climbed into the passenger seat, her eyes scanning the area as if searching for something she couldn't quite see. The feeling of uncertainty hung in the air like a cloud, but there was no turning back now. Marcus started the engine, and they set off, the road stretching before them, leading them into the unknown. As they drove, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He had never imagined that helping Lyra would lead to this, an adventure so far beyond anything he had ever experienced. But he couldn't deny the bond they shared now. She was no longer just an alien girl. She was his responsibility, and he would do whatever it took to help her. Hours passed as they drove through small towns and empty highways. Lyra didn't speak much, but she kept her eyes on the horizon, her thoughts distant. Marcus knew she was trying to prepare herself for whatever they would face next. "We'll get there," Marcus said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, though his heart was racing. "You're not alone, Lyra. We'll find your people." Lyra turned to him, her expression softening. For a brief moment, the tension in the van seemed to lift. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her touch warm but firm. It was a simple gesture, but to Marcus, it meant everything. After a long day of driving, they finally arrived at a small, quiet town, nestled in the shadows of towering mountains. Marcus pulled the van into a secluded area on the outskirts, away from the main road. It was the perfect place to stop and plan their next move. They needed to rest, but more importantly, they needed to figure out where the trail Lyra's mother had mentioned could be found. As they stepped out of the van, Marcus looked around. The town was quiet, almost eerily so. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the land. There was something strange about this place, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. But he pushed the feeling aside. They didn't have time for doubts. "We should start searching tomorrow," Marcus said, glancing at Lyra. "Rest tonight, and we'll be ready to go in the morning." Lyra nodded, though she didn't seem tired. She looked out at the mountains, her gaze distant and thoughtful. For a moment, Marcus could see the weight of her past in her eyes. She had been through so much already, and now she was facing the unknown with nothing but hope and a desire to find her people. That night, they found a small, abandoned cabin near the edge of the town. It was old but sturdy, and it would provide them with the shelter they needed. Inside, the cabin was simple: wooden floors, a fireplace, and a few pieces of old furniture. It wasn't much, but it would do. As Marcus unpacked their supplies, Lyra sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the mountains in the distance. There was something about them that seemed to call to her, something familiar. "Do you think this is it?" Marcus asked, sitting beside her. Lyra didn't answer right away. She looked at the mountains, then back at Marcus. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a sense of quiet certainty in her eyes. "I think we're close," she said softly. I can feel it." The next morning, they set out early, hiking toward the mountains. The air was crisp, and the ground beneath their feet was rugged and uneven. The journey was harder than Marcus had anticipated, but Lyra moved with a grace and confidence that left him in awe. It was as if the mountains themselves were guiding her, as if she knew exactly where to go. After hours of climbing, they reached a plateau. From there, they could see the valley below, dotted with small, ancient structures. Some were overgrown with vines, while others looked untouched by time. There was something about this place that felt different, something ancient. Lyra's eyes widened as she stepped forward, her gaze fixed on one of the structures. It was a large stone building, its walls covered in the same symbols she had drawn for Marcus. The markings matched those on the pod, the ones from her home. This was it, the trail her mother had left. Lyra turned to Marcus, her face filled with a mix of awe and determination. "It's here," she whispered. "This is where I'm meant to be." Marcus smiled, though his heart was heavy with the knowledge that the hardest part of their journey was still ahead. But for now, they had found the first piece of the puzzle. They had arrived, and the answers they were seeking were just within reach. The stone structure loomed before them, a silent sentinel from a forgotten time. Lyra stood at the edge of the plateau, staring at the ancient building with wide eyes. It was as if the structure itself held the key to everything: her past, her family, and the mystery that had brought her to Earth. The symbols carved into the stone were familiar to her, like a language she had known once but had almost forgotten. Marcus stood beside her, feeling a mix of awe and uncertainty. The air was heavy with the weight of their journey, and as they approached the entrance, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover something far more profound than they had imagined. Whatever lay inside this ancient place, it would change everything. They stepped forward, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. The entrance to the building was small, almost hidden beneath overgrown vines and moss. Lyra brushed the vines aside with ease, her fingers brushing against the cold stone. The touch seemed to stir something in her, and for a moment, her eyes flickered with recognition. "Is this it?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Lyra nodded, her expression serious. "This is where my people left their mark. The trail my mother spoke of. It's here." They entered the building cautiously, the air inside cool and musty. The walls were lined with intricate carvings, depicting scenes that Lyra could almost understand. They showed images of beings like her, tall, elegant, with shimmering skin and dark eyes. But these carvings were different from anything she had seen before. They weren't just pictures. They were stories, stories of triumph and tragedy, of battles fought and lost. At the far end of the room, they found a large pedestal, its surface covered in dust. Lyra approached it, her heart racing. She could feel the power of the place, the energy that had been waiting for her. As she stepped closer, the symbols on the pedestal began to glow faintly, responding to her presence. "Do you think it will activate?" Marcus asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Lyra didn't answer right away. She reached out and placed her hand on the pedestal. The moment her fingers touched the surface, the glow intensified, and a soft hum filled the room. It was as if the entire building was alive, reacting to her touch. The hum grew louder, and suddenly, a holographic image appeared above the pedestal. Lyra stepped back, her breath catching in her throat. The image was clear this time. Her mother, standing in a grand chamber, surrounded by other figures. The woman looked older now, her face drawn with worry, but her eyes were full of love. She looked directly at Lyra, as if she knew she was there, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "My daughter," the image said, her voice warm but filled with urgency. "I knew you would come. You are the key to everything. The future of our people rests in your hands." Lyra's heart swelled at the sound of her mother's voice. She could feel the weight of the words, the responsibility that had been passed to her. The message wasn't just for her. It was for the survival of her entire species. "There is a great danger approaching," The woman continued, "The enemies of our people have found us, and they are coming for you. They believe you hold the power to change everything, and they will stop at nothing to control it. You must prepare." The image shifted, showing a vast, dark fleet of ships approaching from the stars. The sight was enough to send a chill down Marcus's spine. These were not peaceful travelers. These were invaders, and they were coming for Lyra and her people. "We have set a path for you," the image said. "It will lead you to the heart of our civilization. There, you will find the answers you seek. But be careful, Lyra. The enemies we face are unlike any you have ever known. They are cunning and ruthless." The hologram flickered for a moment, and Lyra took a deep breath. Her mother's message was clear. The time to act was now. "Lyra," her mother's voice continued, "remember who you are. You are not just a girl from another world. You are the heir to our throne, the one destined to lead us into the future. The power is within you. It always has been." With that, the image faded, leaving only the soft hum in the air. Lyra stood frozen, her mind racing. She had always known there was more to her story, more to her purpose. But now, the truth had been revealed. She wasn't just a lost traveler. She was a princess, and heir to a kingdom, and the hope of her people rested on her shoulders. Marcus stepped forward, his voice soft. "What do we do now?" Lyra turned to him, her face a mix of determination and uncertainty. "We have to prepare. I need to find the heart of my people, the place where everything began. It's the only way to stop them." Marcus nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I'll help you." Every step of the way. Together, they turned toward the exit, the weight of their journey heavier than ever. The road ahead would be filled with danger, but Lyra was no longer the lost alien girl who had stumbled onto Earth. She was a princess, a leader, and she had a mission to fulfill. As they left the building and stepped back into the light, Lyra felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. The future of her people was in her hands, and she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She would find her way home, and she would stop the enemies who threatened her world. With Marcus by her side, Lyra knew she wasn't alone. The journey was just beginning, and they would face it together.